All right. Hey, everybody. Dan here, and it is Friday, kind of a wacky Friday, the 14th. And just a heads up on a couple things. By the way, I'm going to be looking at NVIDIA in just a minute. But to members, I recorded, well, I actually did it live a couple hours ago. I got online and we looked at the market over the last hour or so, and I was really explaining some things that are super important to understand this market, about just specific chart patterns, pardon me, and also how to be using the VIX, relying on the VIX to interpret price action, when to buy, when to not buy, when to hold, when to not hold, basically when to hold them, when to fold them, all of that kind of stuff. Went into a lot of detail on that. And so if you can watch it in fast speed, because God, I think I was on for about an hour and a half, but you can watch it in fast speed. I promise you, there's a lot of great information on there. And also, I did a couple things. First of all, I rattled off my trading strategy, because I'll hear that all the time. Well, you talk about your trading strategy. Well, I don't understand. What is it? And, tell me more, which I get. And so the thing that I was saying was, if you cannot just describe your trading strategy just off the top of your head, then you don't really have a strategy. You have something else. But you literally should, if somebody says, okay, well, what's your trading strategy? You should be able to start with three words. Oh, my strategy. And then you should just be able to explain what your strategy is in some pretty good detail. And so I kind of modeled that. And what I wound up with was a a pretty good transcript of what my strategy is. And I will be sending that out. We'll do it on Monday or something, but I'll be sending that out to you in bullet point and in organized form if you're a member. So definitely check that out. And by the way, if you're a non-member, guess what? You can hoodwink me. You can get all that by joining Stock Market Mentor for $7. Then you can get all that stuff. Oh, but wait, there's more. The other thing that I was talking about, because a lot of this stuff was intraday, and I was mentioning about the 59-minute trader, we've got a Black Friday, the typical Black Friday, Cyber Monday, Terrible Tuesday, Wacky Wednesday, I don't know, Throwback Thursday, probably forgot a day in there. But we're sending out emails on that pretty soon. I think maybe today or tomorrow. And I was going over some of the tactics in the 59-minute trader. And this is something that I taught less than a year ago. And we're putting it on sale. And it is without a doubt the lowest price that we've ever put it on. And to be perfectly candid with you, I don't know what price we're selling it at. And that's by design. First of all, I'm kind of lazy and I don't give a shit about that. But second of all, I don't like to be talking about prices, and I don't want to be fixated on stuff like that. I hire people to do that, and I just want to trade and teach trading. That's kind of what gets me going. But I did want to make it really available to people. And I know, with respect to the economy, and just kind of in general, a general feeling of, money's tight. I totally get that. But what I wanted to do was if you are watching this, hopefully you're trading, but I wanted to really take away any excuse that someone might have to not learn about how the markets work intraday. It's really important that you know that, even if you never make a day trade in your life. It's just important to understand how the market works, because understanding that will keep you from doing dumb stuff that you shouldn't be doing, and it will enable you to do smart stuff that you might not normally be able to see. So this is pretty important for you. And so I'm making it at a price that's pretty much accessible to anybody. And I'm also only for those people who take advantage of this special soon. we're going to be trading live, which is the only way you can trade. We're going to be trading live Nvidia's earnings on the 20th. So anybody who hops on the bandwagon and gets that course will be invited to that session. And it's only, just to be clear, it's only for traders, for members who are taking advantage of this sale. That's really important that you understand that. Or those who actually purchased this course when I taught it live earlier this year. So what I'm saying is I've taught this course a bunch of times over the past umpteen years, and I'm just talking about this course, the most recent one, because, well, just because. Okay. So anyway, definitely check it out. And my goal, so you know, I can't make any promises, but my goal is to help you make your dough back during that session. In other words, if we're going to make some money, let's see if we can do it on Nvidia or some other stock that's working, make a few good trades and get that course paid for. So that's what my hope is. All right, Nvidia. So this is the deal, and I went through this in today's session and a lot of other stocks too. But I want to talk about this, first of all, from a relative strength standpoint, meaning how is it performing relative to the S&P 500? Nvidia's been it's been sucking the tailpipe here. It just really hadn't been working real well. Now it's pulled back, but you could say, well, so has the market, but not as much. The market was very close to all-time highs not too very long ago. So Nvidia's actually, they've both been pulling back, but Nvidia's been pulling back more. Now, because of the carnage in the market the last couple days, a lot of pundits are pointing to Nvidia. They report on the 19th, next Wednesday night, and that's Nvidia could save the market. If they post great numbers, it's going to bring everything up. Everything's going to get back on track. Okay, I could be wrong about this. I could totally be wrong about this. And if I am, I will be the first to admit it. I really will, but I'm just going to be candid with you. I think that's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. I get how important NVIDIA is, no question about it. But information gets out and factored into the market in more than 1 nanosecond when the numbers come out. And a lot of things that are going to be relevant in this earnings are what's said in the conference call. Anybody can guide up, anybody can guide down, but the real question is then when the next numbers come out, was that guidance accurate? And I'll say typically it wasn't. And the reason is because that's why they're always adjusting, making adjustments and modifications in guidance. But NVIDIA is it's actually very important, as you guys know, obviously, but there's a hell of a lot more to the AI thing than Blackwell. There's a lot more. And so we've already seen some major corrections here. Let's just look at Rigetti, for example, not to pick on that. But so is NVIDIA, is a great number for NVIDIA really going to fix this? Is this really what's going to happen? The answer is, at least my answer is, absolutely not. Now, this might pop up a little bit or something, maybe a lot, but these are broken stocks. They're busted. They're broken. Maybe ultimately this thing will get to $100, but guess what? Unless they do a 4-for-1 reverse stock split, it ain't going to happen anytime soon. It's going to take a long time to repair. Look what happened here. You got a very similar thing back here, over 1,000% return. Okay. Then we got a 70% retracement. Here, what did we get? Oh my gosh, it was only a like 230% return. And what did we get for a retracement? 60% retracement. What did we have in between? Golly gee, only 8.5 months. So my point is, it's going to take a long time for this to recover. And I don't care what number Nvidia puts out. It's not going to have more than a day or two impact on these other stocks. So don't even be thinking about that. At least, again, I'll say it because I have to. I may be totally wrong. And if so, then like I said, I'll be the first to admit it. I don't have any pride or any ego in this stuff. I'm just telling you what I think. So, what are we going to do with NVIDIA between now and Wednesday's close? This is what I think we're going to do. We look at 180 as pretty solid support. And I'm just talking short term. After earnings, ask somebody who cares. I don't know what's going to happen. But if you look at this as pretty solid support, then if you're buying this thing on Monday, you keep a stop just a little bit below today's intraday low. That's less than 5.5% risk. And you could even keep it tighter than that if you're looking at some intraday numbers like volume weighted average price and stuff, which, by the way, I go into on the 59-minute trader in pretty good detail. And we will next week as well. But anyway, so you can keep a pretty tight stop on this, but the projection can't, I mean, you could say, and this could very well happen. You could project like a move to 200 prior to earnings. That wouldn't surprise me at all if it did this. In fact, I actually have to say it would surprise me if it didn't. So I would expect like a 5% move between now and earnings. After that, I don't know. But if you just want to frame this trade as a short-term trade, you can do this. You can set yourself a nice risk here of about 5.5%, maybe more, and then look for a move to 200. Now, you can say, and you would be justified in saying, yeah, but that's only like a 1-for-1, Dan. And I thought you're always talking about um, don't make a trade unless at least you have a 2R multiple, should be even 3 or more. And R multiples meaning how many dollars can I make for every dollar that I risk. So you could actually do it this way. If you really want a super tight stop, you look at the volume weighted average price, which is this orange line here. This is the average price at which all the shares traded on Friday today. So all during the day, 187.78 is the average price that shares of Nvidia traded. So you can actually use this as a reference for your risk and say, well, if the stock pulls down below the volume weighted average price from Friday, then that's a problem and it's probably not going to run higher. And so if you're doing that, you can set your stop right around 187, 187.50 and keep a super tight stop on this. Now, you could say, oh yeah, but what if I get stopped out? Well, too bad, so sad. You got stopped out. Welcome to trading. It'll happen. But this is one way that you can keep a pretty tight leash on a trade and get a great return, a great R multiple return, and only need to see the stock run up 9 or 10 bucks. Okay. So anyway, that's all I got for you. I'll say it again. I'm totally serious about this. You really want to be considering the 59-minute trader. We're going to have an awesome session on Thursday. And by the way, this is just something that I decided to do earlier today. I don't think you're going to see that in the email, in any of the emails or marketing that I'm sending out. I think they might change it. I don't know. But I just decided, okay, what the hell, we'll do it. We'll put this stuff into play on Thursday, next Thursday on NVIDIA. So this would be my suggestion. If this is at all interesting to you, then you take advantage of this right now so that you're able not just to get the course, but take some time to go through it. I want you to learn it so that at least have a general understanding of what the heck I'm doing, so that when we're actually doing it, you're not going like, well, wait a minute, I didn't understand this. Well, what about that? What's this? What's that? Which you're gonna have a lot of questions unless you actually go through the course. So anyway, I'm pounding the table on that. I just think this is really important for you to be doing. I work hard. Scott works hard. Andy works hard. Sam works hard. We all work really, really hard, and our goal is to help you become the best trader you can be. And I think that, like I said, I think the concepts that I'm teaching in the 59-minute trader are, I think they're critical for anybody. It doesn't matter your time frame. You're just going to use it in different ways. So that's all I have to say about it. Like I said, next Thursday morning, if you're not if you're not in by then, you're not in. You're not invited. Okay. All right. I will. I'll see you all next time. Okay. Have a good weekend.